The alien woman entered my cabin to escape the storm, but she couldn't speak when she saw I was human. The storm was relentless. Dark clouds churned above, casting an ominous shadow over the barren surface of the distant planet. Winds howled through the thick atmosphere, carrying with them the promise of destruction. Commander John Reyes, stationed alone at the research cabin, stood by the large window, watching the chaotic display outside. The storm was unlike anything he had seen in his years of exploration. It was more than just a weather phenomenon. It was a warning. He had hoped to get some rest before the next shift began, but the shrill gusts of wind kept him awake. His hand brushed against the cool surface of the control panel next to the window. He had been on this planet for weeks, analyzing the local weather patterns, and everything had seemed normal. At least until today. There had been no signs of the storm's sudden ferocity. It had appeared out of nowhere, and now it trapped him inside this small cabin, isolated from the rest of his team. John sighed and pulled his jacket tighter around himself. The wind rattled the metal walls of the cabin, and for a moment he wondered if the building would hold up. The storm was a threat, but he knew he was safe, inside at least. His team was stationed on another planet far from this place. They would be no help until the storm passed, which could take days. Then there was a sound, something soft, almost like a knock on the door. John stiffened, the quiet of the cabin broken by the noise. He had not expected visitors. No one was supposed to be within 100 miles of this facility. A glance at the radar screen showed no ships nearby. It was impossible. But the knocking continued, this time louder, more urgent. With a frown, John crossed the room to the door. He reached for the handle, pausing for a brief moment as a sense of unease washed over him. The storm was fierce, but who would be out there in the middle of this chaos? He opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find nothing but wind and rain. Instead, he was met with the sight of an alien woman, her figure half obscured by the heavy rain that poured from the sky. She stood before him, soaked to the bone, her long hair plastered against her face, her eyes wide with fear. Her alien features were striking, smooth skin with an iridescent sheen, pointed ears, and eyes that reflected the storm's fury. She looked lost, confused, and most of all, terrified. John instinctively stepped back, allowing her to enter. He quickly shut the door behind her, shutting out the roar of the storm. She was clearly drenched, and her body trembled as she stood in the middle of the small cabin, her gaze darting between the walls, as if unsure of where to go. John didn't know what to say. He could tell she wasn't from the planet. Her species was unfamiliar to him. Her presence here in the middle of a storm so violent was unexpected and strange. "Are you all right?" John asked, his voice steady despite the confusion running through his mind. His training had prepared him for many things, but not for this. The woman looked at him, and for a brief moment their eyes locked. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then stopped, her expression changing to one of even deeper confusion. She tried again, but no words came. A soft gasp escaped her lips, and she looked away quickly, her eyes scanning the cabin once more. John didn't know what to make of her reaction. It wasn't fear of the storm, he could tell that much. It was something else, something more personal. Her gaze lingered on him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, her lips parting as if she were trying to say something, but no sound came. "Hey, it's okay," John said, his voice gentle. "You're safe here. You can sit down if you want." He gestured toward the small table and chairs by the fire, hoping to offer her some comfort. She hesitated for a moment before slowly moving toward the fire, her steps hesitant. John watched her closely, trying to read her body language. She was clearly not used to human interaction, and her unease only grew as she moved across the room. John couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here, to this desolate outpost in the middle of nowhere. She didn't seem injured, but there was something about the way she held herself, fragile, tense, as if she had been through something far more terrifying than a mere storm. Was she in danger? He moved to the nearby kitchen counter, boiling some water. As he worked, he glanced over his shoulder, watching her carefully. She hadn't moved from the fire, her eyes flicking over the room in quick, nervous glances. John knew better than to push her. Whatever had happened outside, it had left her in a state of shock. She needed time. After a few minutes, John turned to her, holding out a steaming mug of hot water. "You look like you could use this." She looked at the mug for a moment, then slowly reached out to take it, her hands trembling slightly as she grasped it. She didn't drink, though, she just held it, staring down at the liquid inside. John wasn't sure if she was refusing or if she just didn't understand what it was. "Are you thirsty?" he asked gently, his tone soothing. The woman nodded faintly, still not meeting his gaze. John sighed. She had not spoken, and now she was avoiding eye contact. He couldn't help but feel an odd sense of responsibility for her, as though it was his duty to figure out how to communicate with her to help her find a way to speak. "Do you need anything?" he asked. There was no response, but she finally lifted the mug to her lips and took a small sip. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the storm outside. John watched her for a few more moments, wondering what to do next. Something told him this was no ordinary encounter. He couldn't explain why, but he felt as though there was more to this than simply helping a lost traveler take shelter from a storm. She was hiding something she couldn't, or wouldn't, share. The more John tried to understand, the more questions arose. Where had she come from? What was her purpose here? And most importantly, why was she so afraid of him? But before he could ask, she stood up abruptly, as if she had made a decision. She didn't look at him as she moved to the window, pressing her hands against the cold glass, gazing out into the violent storm. John followed her, his footsteps light on the metal floor. "You're not safe out there," he said, unsure whether she could even understand him. She didn't respond, but her eyes were fixed on the storm. John felt a chill run down his spine. The way she stood, her posture rigid, made it seem as if she was waiting for something. But what? Without warning, she turned back to face him, her eyes locking with his once more. For the first time since she entered, there was something in her expression, something powerful. Her lips parted, and for a fleeting moment, John thought she might speak. But once again, no words came. Only silence. The storm outside raged on, the winds howling as if they were alive, battering the walls of the small cabin. John watched as the alien woman stood near the window, her eyes fixed on the chaotic landscape beyond. She didn't seem to care about the storm anymore, as if it was nothing compared to whatever had brought her to this cabin in the first place. John couldn't understand it. He'd seen many strange things during his career as a commander, but this was different. She had entered his cabin, drenched and trembling, yet now she stood there unmoving, her gaze fixed on the wild winds. The more he watched her, the more questions filled his mind. What was she running from, and why couldn't she speak? Was it fear? Or was it something else entirely? For the first time since she had arrived, John felt a deep unease. It wasn't just her silence that unnerved him, but the way she held herself, tightly, as if she were trying to protect something. The fear in her eyes seemed to suggest that whatever she was hiding, it was a lot worse than the storm outside. John couldn't stand the silence any longer. "You're safe here," he said, his voice calm, though his own heart raced. "The storm is fierce, but we're inside. Nothing can get to us here." She didn't move, she didn't even blink. John's frustration started to build. It was as if she was trapped in her own world and he couldn't reach her. He crossed the room and stood beside her, trying once more to get her attention. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." At that, her head snapped toward him, her eyes wide and filled with something John couldn't quite place. Was it recognition, or was it even more fear? She opened her mouth as if to speak again, but still nothing came out. Her hands, once trembling, now clenched into fists at her sides. John took a step back, unsure of what to do. The whole situation felt wrong, like there was something he was missing. "I don't know what happened," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "But I'm here to help. You can trust me." She looked at him for a long time, and then, just as suddenly as she had started, she turned her back to him. Her attention was once again fixed on the storm outside, her expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. John had been trained for high-pressure situations, but this was different. There was a tension in the air, a palpable unease that settled over the room. He was used to working in high-risk environments, but nothing had prepared him for this. He wanted to understand her, to break through the walls she had put up. But how? She had entered his cabin without warning, and ever since then, every time he tried to talk to her, she would retreat further into herself. The harder he tried to break the silence, the more it deepened. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke, only a single word, barely a whisper. "Escape!" The word hung in the air between them, and for a moment, John didn't understand. Escape from what? From the storm? From something else? Before he could ask, she turned to face him, her body tense, her eyes scanning him as if measuring his every movement. It was then that he saw it. There was something about her gaze, a recognition, as if she had seen him before. or perhaps more accurately as if she knew him. Her lips parted again, but no sound came. She raised a hand, pointing to the door. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she was insistent. It was clear that she wanted to leave. But where could she possibly go in the middle of a storm like this? "Where do you want to go?" John asked, his voice filled with concern. Her eyes widened and she shook her head slowly. She seemed to be torn between something, her need to escape, and the fear that whatever was out there was worse than staying in the cabin. John felt the tension rising in the room. She wasn't just afraid of the storm, she was afraid of something else. But what? And why was she so desperate to leave? Her fear was palpable, and it only made him more determined to understand. "We can't go out there," he said, his voice steady. "It's not safe. The storm is dangerous. We can wait it out. You can stay here as long as you need." She looked at him, her eyes flashing with something that almost felt like an apology, but it was gone in an instant. She was about to turn away when a loud crash echoed from outside the cabin, followed by the sudden creak of metal. John froze. Something was coming. His heart began to race as he rushed to the door, looking out through the small window. The storm outside was blinding, but he could make out shapes in the distance. The figures were moving fast, and their presence sent a chill down his spine. The alien woman's eyes widened in alarm. She stepped back from the door, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. John felt a knot form in his stomach. Whatever was out there was bad news, and the woman who had been silent for so long seemed to know exactly what it was. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice filled with urgency. "What's going on?" "You need to tell me." She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then stopped, her face pale. She stepped backward, pressing herself against the wall. Her hands were shaking and her breathing quickened. John could see the terror in her eyes. "They're here for me," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I've been running." John felt his heart race. "From who? Who are they?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the door, as if expecting the figures outside to break it down at any moment. She seemed to be waiting for something, for someone. And John realized with growing horror that whatever these figures were, they were here for her. The door rattled suddenly, and John took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. The storm outside seemed to be growing louder, but the sounds of the figures moving closer made it clear they were already on the doorstep. John had no choice. He had to protect her. But how could he fight something in the storm, something he couldn't even see? The woman glanced at him, her eyes full of desperation, her fear now undeniable. "You have to help me," she said, her voice breaking. "Please." John didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm gently but firmly, leading her to the back of the cabin. The storm outside had turned into a fierce gale, and the wind whipped around them, making the air thick with tension. Whatever was coming, they needed to be ready. But as they moved toward the back door, the alien woman froze. Her eyes widened with terror as she pulled away from him, her voice barely a whisper. "They're here," she said, trembling. "It's too late." John spun around, his heart pounding. The sound of footsteps was unmistakable. Someone or something was about to break through the door. The door shook violently as the figures outside pressed against it, their movement making the metal frame groan in protest. John's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The alien woman beside him was visibly trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She pressed her back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. It was clear that whatever was on the other side of that door was far worse than the storm outside. John reached for his weapon instinctively. He had always been trained to face danger head-on, but this situation was different. He didn't know who or what they were dealing with. All he knew was that these creatures, whoever they were, had tracked the woman here, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. The door rattled again, harder this time, as if something was trying to break it down. The sound was deafening. John looked at the woman, his mind racing. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm but reassuring. He could see the fear in her eyes, but she nodded, taking a few cautious steps backward, her hands still shaking. The tension in the air was thick. John didn't know how long they had before the door would give way. The storm outside made it difficult to hear anything clearly, but he could still make out the soft sounds of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate steps. Whoever, or whatever, was coming for them wasn't in a hurry. It was as if they knew they had all the time in the world. John's eyes flicked to the window, his mind already working out a plan. The wind was howling fiercely, and the visibility outside was near zero. If they could make it to the nearby communication tower, they might be able to send a distress signal. But the journey wouldn't be easy, and the danger outside wasn't something he could take lightly. The woman caught his eye again, and for the first time since she had arrived, she looked like she was about to speak. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she raised her hand in a strange gesture, one that seemed to convey urgency. Her fingers twitched, as if she was trying to tell him something, but again, nothing came. She was silent, her gaze pleading with him to understand. John swallowed hard, trying to focus. He could see the fear in her eyes, but it wasn't just fear, it was desperation. Whatever was coming, she knew that it would be a threat far greater than anything he could imagine. He needed to act, and he needed to act fast. The door rattled again, this time with enough force to make the entire cabin tremble. John's heart skipped a beat as he heard a low, guttural growl from the other side of the door. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before. The sound sent a chill through his spine, and his grip tightened on his weapon. "They're here," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes darted toward the door, then to the window, as if looking for an escape. "You have to leave now." John frowned, shaking his head. "No, I'm not leaving you. I won't let them take you." Her face softened for a moment, but the fear in her eyes remained. She took a step forward, placing her hand on his arm, her fingers cold and trembling. She looked up at him with an intensity that made him freeze. "They won't stop until they have me," she said softly, almost regretfully. "You'll be in danger too if you stay. You need to leave." John shook his head firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Before she could protest again, the door splintered with a loud crash. The force of it threw John back, and he hit the floor hard. He could hear the sound of heavy footsteps entering the cabin, their weight causing the metal floor to groan under the pressure. John scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He grabbed the alien woman's arm and pulled her toward the back of the cabin, away from the door. She resisted for a moment, but then followed, her eyes wide with fear. They reached the small hallway leading to the back exit, but just as John was about to open the door, the sound of footsteps grew louder, much closer now. John's pulse quickened as he realized that there was no time left. The figures were in the cabin now, their presence undeniable. He had no choice but to fight his way out. "We have to move now," John said urgently, turning toward the back door, but before he could open it, the alien woman stopped him. "Wait," she whispered, her voice filled with panic. "They're already here, there's no way out." John's heart sank. He turned to her, his mind racing. "What do you mean, we have to escape?" She shook her head, her eyes darting to the corner of the room. Her fear was palpable, and John could sense that she knew something he didn't. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "They're not just after me, they're after you too." Before he could ask what she meant, a dark figure appeared in the doorway. It was tall and menacing, its silhouette shadowed by the storm's fury outside. The creature's eyes glowed with an eerie red light, and it moved with an unsettling grace, as if it didn't need to hurry. There was a strange, almost unnatural calm about it. John instinctively raised his weapon, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. A voice echoed through the room, deep and resonant, carrying an undeniable authority. "You are the human who chose to stand in our way," the creature said. Its voice was both alien and familiar, as if it was speaking through a language John couldn't fully comprehend. "We've been watching you, and now you will pay the price for your defiance." John's heart raced. The creature's words sent a cold shiver down his spine. They had been watching him. He wasn't just an innocent bystander in this. The storm, the alien woman, everything, it was all connected, and he had unwittingly stepped into a dangerous game. He had no idea what he was up against, but he wasn't about to back down now. "Get away from her," John shouted, his voice filled with authority. He aimed his weapon at the creature, trying to steady his trembling hands. "I won't let you harm her." The creature chuckled softly, a sound that sent a wave of unease through the room. "You think you can stop us, human?" it asked, its voice dripping with amusement. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." John's grip on his weapon tightened. He had to protect her. He couldn't let these creatures take her, not after everything she had been through. Without warning, the creature lunged forward, its speed terrifying. John barely had time to react. The creature knocked the weapon from his hands and sent him crashing to the floor. His head hit the ground with a dull thud, and for a moment everything went black. When John regained consciousness, he found himself on his back, the alien woman kneeling beside him. Her face was etched with worry, but she seemed relieved that he was still alive. "You're not going to win this fight," she said softly, her voice filled with sadness. "You need to understand they've already won. They've been watching us for too long." John blinked, trying to clear his head. "No, I can't let them win." She looked at him with pity, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "You don't have a choice anymore. The game is over. You've already lost." John's mind raced. He didn't know who these creatures were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about survival. It was about something much bigger than himself. John's head spun, and the dim glow of the storm outside seemed to blur into a dizzying whirl of light and shadow. His body ached, and the taste of blood lingered in his mouth. He blinked several times, trying to shake off the disorienting feeling. The alien woman was still kneeling beside him, her face a mixture of worry and determination. She had managed to avoid the strike, but he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on them both. He tried to sit up but found his limbs uncooperative. The impact from the creature's blow had knocked the wind out of him, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Still, he forced himself to push through the pain. The creature, whatever it was, hadn't finished with them. There was more to come, and he couldn't afford to lie down and wait for it. "You need to move," the woman urged, her voice filled with urgency. Her hands gripped his shoulders, helping him sit up. "They're coming for both of us." John took a deep breath, clearing his vision as best as he could. The pain in his chest was sharp, but he ignored it. They couldn't stay here. The enemy was already inside the cabin, and the longer they lingered, the more dangerous it would be. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice strained. He hadn't expected this. He had come to this planet to conduct research, not to be caught in the middle of a hunt. He had no idea who these creatures were or what they wanted, but he knew one thing: they would not stop until they had what they came for. The woman's face was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond immediately, her eyes darting around the cabin as if calculating their next move. John could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, a sense of resignation. She knew more about this situation than she was letting on. "They know everything about me," she finally said, her voice soft but filled with a heavy sadness. "They've been tracking me for a long time. I tried to run, but it's no use. They'll keep coming. They won't stop until I'm back in their hands." John's brow furrowed as he looked at her. "Why? What do they want from you? Why are they chasing you?" She hesitated, her gaze falling to the ground. "They want something that belongs to me, something I can't let them have." John's mind raced. The situation was growing more complicated by the minute. This wasn't just a random attack. These creatures had been hunting her, and now they had brought their hunt to his doorstep. But why? What was it that was so important? Before he could ask more questions, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin and his heart skipped a beat. The creatures were closing in. There was no more time for talking. "We need to move," John said urgently, pushing himself to his feet with the woman's help. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he stood firm, unwilling to show weakness. They had to escape, and they had to do it now. The woman nodded, her expression steely with determination. "There's a back exit," she said quickly, her eyes scanning the room for a way out. "It leads to a small tunnel system underneath the cabin. If we can make it there, we might have a chance to escape." John didn't hesitate. He moved toward the back of the cabin, the woman right behind him. Every step was a struggle, but he couldn't afford to waste any time. The pounding footsteps outside were growing louder, and he knew they didn't have much time before their pursuers found them. The back exit was a small, inconspicuous door, hidden in the corner of the cabin. The woman quickly unlocked it, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. John hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the door, but the sounds of the creatures getting closer pushed him forward. There was no choice. They had to take the risk. "Go," the woman urged, her voice sharp with fear. "We can't wait." John took a deep breath and stepped into the tunnel, the woman following closely behind. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of earth and metal filled his nostrils. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for two people to move side by side. The walls were rough and the floor was uneven, but it was their only hope of escape. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. John could feel the woman's presence behind him, her breath shallow with fear. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder to make sure she was still with him. He didn't know where this tunnel would lead, but he had no choice but to trust her. The further they went, the more the silence seemed to weigh on them. The storm above, the pounding of footsteps, the danger, everything felt distant now, as if they were in a world of their own. But John knew they couldn't afford to lose focus. Every step brought them closer to safety, but also closer to the unknown. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The tunnel twisted and turned, winding through the earth beneath the cabin. At one point, they had to crawl through a narrow passage, the air growing thick with dust. John's muscles burned, but he kept moving. He couldn't stop. Not now. Finally, they reached a small room at the end of the tunnel. It was dimly lit by flickering lights embedded in the walls. The woman moved quickly to a control panel in the corner, her fingers flying over the buttons as she worked. John stood in the middle of the room, his senses on high alert. He could hear the faint sounds of movement in the distance, but they were no longer a direct threat. They were hidden for now. The woman finished entering a sequence of commands, and a section of the wall slid open to reveal a small hatch. She turned to him, her face grim. "This leads to an underground network of safe houses," she said. "We'll be safe for a while. But we have to keep moving. They'll find us again if we stay in one place for too long." John nodded, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to think about the future right now. All that mattered was staying alive and getting away from whatever was chasing them. "Lead the way," he said, his voice firm. Without another word, the woman climbed into the hatch, and John followed. The underground tunnels stretched for miles, each turn a new uncertainty. The deeper they went, the further they left the cabin and the storm behind. The tunnel was silent, but the tension between them was palpable. John kept his eyes forward, his thoughts spinning. The woman had told him little about what was really going on. She had hinted at something important, something dangerous that these creatures were after. But she hadn't shared enough to understand the full picture. What did she mean by "something that belongs to me"? What was so valuable that they were willing to chase her across planets? The answers could come later. Right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. They traveled for what felt like hours, moving in and out of the dark passages. The air grew colder, the walls more narrow. Finally, they reached another junction in the tunnel. The woman stopped and looked at him. Her eyes were filled with something. Was it hope or fear? He couldn't tell. "We're close now," she said quietly. "But we're not safe yet. We can't stop moving." John nodded, determination settling in his chest. The storm, the chase, the creatures, they were all a distant memory now. The only thing that mattered was getting through whatever came next. The tunnels stretched out in every direction, dark and winding, as if they were part of an ancient, forgotten world. John could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The further they went, the more distant the sounds of the storm above became. The air down here was thick with dust and the smell of old stone. Each step felt like it could lead to another danger, but it also brought them further from the enemies pursuing them. For now, that was enough. The woman, still ahead of him, moved swiftly, her eyes scanning the path before them with a sharpness that John had come to rely on. She was no stranger to this place, and that gave him some comfort. She had been running for a long time, and he knew she wouldn't stop until she had a way to escape whatever was chasing her. But he couldn't help but wonder, what was she running from? And why was it so important that they couldn't stop, even for a moment? They reached another narrow passage, one so tight that John had to bend low to move through it. The woman slipped ahead of him with ease, but he was still struggling to keep up. His body ached, every muscle protesting, but he kept moving. There was no other choice. The passage finally opened into a small, dimly lit chamber, the walls covered in strange symbols that John couldn't begin to understand. There was a small table in the center, cluttered with papers and old equipment. The woman moved to the table, her hands trembling slightly as she sifted through the papers. "Are we close?" John asked, his voice hoarse from the journey. She nodded, her eyes still focused on the papers in front of her. "We're getting there, but we can't stop here. They'll find us if we stay too long." John didn't argue. He knew the urgency in her voice was real. They had been running for hours, and every moment they spent in one place felt like a risk. The creatures chasing them wouldn't stop, not until they had what they wanted. "What's on these papers?" John asked, moving closer to her. She glanced up, her expression tight. "These are coordinates, locations where we can hide, but they're more than just safe houses. These places, they're connected to what's happening, to what they're after." John felt his heart skip a beat. "What are they after?" The woman paused, her fingers still on the papers. "Something ancient, a weapon, and it's hidden in one of these places." She looked up at him, her eyes dark with worry. "That's what they've been chasing me for. That's why they won't stop." John's mind raced. A weapon. The idea seemed almost too much to comprehend. He had seen war, understood violence, but the thought of an ancient weapon, one so powerful that it could drive an entire species to hunt someone down, it was terrifying. "You've been running because of this weapon?" John asked. The woman nodded grimly. "I'm the only one who knows where it is, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. They'll destroy anything and anyone in their way." John's thoughts were a blur. He had never asked for any of this. He had been sent here for research, not to be caught in the middle of some galactic conspiracy. But now everything had changed. The storm, the chase, the creatures, it was all tied to this weapon, and somehow he was now a part of it. A low rumble echoed through the tunnels, and John's heart skipped a beat. The sound grew louder, and soon it was joined by the unmistakable footsteps of the creatures. They were getting closer. The woman's face hardened. "We need to move, now." She grabbed the papers and stuffed them into a bag slung over her shoulder. Without another word, she turned and sprinted toward the tunnel's exit. John followed, his legs aching with every step. The tunnel twisted and turned, becoming even more confusing as they hurried through it. He had no idea where they were going, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let them catch them. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The footsteps behind them grew louder, closer. It was clear that the creatures were not far behind. They were tracking them, and every moment they spent running was another chance for them to be caught. John pushed his body harder, ignoring the pain in his legs. They couldn't stop. Finally, the woman stopped at another junction. She turned to John, her face etched with determination. "There's a hidden exit ahead. It'll take us to the surface. From there, we'll be able to find the next safe house." John nodded, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "Let's go." They moved quickly, the woman leading the way. As they ran, John's thoughts were consumed with one question: how much longer could they keep running? How many tunnels, how many hideouts, how many safe houses would they need before they were free? The rumbling sound of their pursuers grew louder still, echoing through the narrow passages. John could hear their heavy footsteps now, pounding against the stone floor. He could almost feel their presence, like a shadow that followed them, ready to close in at any moment. Finally, they reached the hidden exit, another metal door, its surface covered in layers of dirt and grime. The woman worked quickly, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she unlocked the door. John stood guard, watching the tunnel behind them, every nerve in his body on edge. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond. The woman stepped forward, her eyes scanning the path ahead. "We're almost there," she said quietly, though John could hear the tension in her voice. "But we're not safe yet." John's heart pounded in his chest as he followed her into the darkness. The world outside was quiet, the sounds of the storm muted by the thick stone walls surrounding them. He had no idea where they were now, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to stop. Not until he knew what they were up against, and not until he knew what these creatures were after. They moved through the darkness, their footsteps the only sound that echoed in the tunnel. The woman seemed to know exactly where she was going, her pace unbroken, her determination unwavering. John kept close behind, every sense alert, every muscle tense. Suddenly, a shrill noise echoed through the tunnel, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against stone. John's heart skipped a beat as the woman froze, her body tense. "They're close," she whispered. John didn't waste any time. "We need to move faster." She nodded and pushed forward, but this time her steps were more urgent. They were almost at the surface, almost to freedom, but the creatures were closing in fast. John could hear them now, heavy footsteps, gruff voices echoing in the tunnel. They were almost there. "Please," the woman whispered, "just a little further." John pushed his legs harder, willing himself to move faster. His breath came in sharp gasps, his body screaming for a break, but there was no time. They had to reach the surface. They had to escape. And then, just as they reached the final stretch, the woman stopped. She turned to John, her eyes filled with something, hope, fear, maybe both. "They're not far behind," she said softly, "but this is where we part ways." John stopped, confused. "What do you mean?" The woman's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "You've helped me more than I could ever repay, but the danger isn't over. The weapon thereafter, it's more powerful than you can imagine. I can't let them use you to get to it." John stepped forward, determined. "I'm not leaving you, not now." But the woman shook her head. "You've already done enough." She reached into her bag, pulling out a small, glowing device. "This will lead you to the safe house. It will protect you, but only if you leave now." John didn't want to leave her, but he knew there was no choice. She had to face whatever was coming on her own. With a heavy heart, he accepted the device from her, his fingers brushing against hers for a moment. "Stay safe," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You too. And remember, don't trust anyone until you know the whole story." John turned and began to walk away, the weight of her words sinking in. The woman had given him a chance to survive, but now it was up to him to find the answers. The storm above was nothing compared to the storm that awaited him, and whatever it was, he would face it head-on.